I knew something was wrong the moment I woke up to the sound of engines behind my property. Engines that weren't supposed to be there. When I stepped outside, there were survey flags stabbed into my backyard like they owned the place, and a crew I'd never met preparing to carve a road straight through my land. No warning, no permission, just the HOA deciding my property was theirs to rearrange. But the moment I confronted them, everything spiraled into a level of arrogance and deceit I never thought possible. Before everything turned into a battlefield of property lines and paperwork, life in the neighborhood felt almost deceptively calm. The community was one of those neatly packaged developments where every lawn looked like it came out of the same catalog and every mailbox stood at the same exact height. As if the place had been measured with a ruler, rather than built with a sense of individuality. It wasn't perfect, but it was predictable, and predictable felt comfortable. The homeowner, someone who had worked hard to finally live in a place where peace felt like a daily routine, never imagined that peace could be disturbed by something as simple as a patch of land behind their house. It was a modest space, mostly grass and a few trees, the kind of quiet buffer most people took for granted. Kids rode bikes along the sidewalks, retirees waved from their porches, and even the occasional barking dog felt like part of the rhythm of the community. Nothing about the area suggested the kind of hostility that would eventually rise to the surface. When the homeowner moved in, the HOA came across as orderly rather than overbearing. Monthly newsletters spoke more about seasonal potlucks than enforcement policies. The board members introduced themselves with overly practiced smiles, but seemed harmless enough. Just the usual group of volunteers who enjoyed feeling involved. No one talked about power struggles or hidden agendas. No one mentioned disputes. And certainly no one warned that certain board members were known for quietly expanding their influence into places they didn't belong. The first hint of trouble came in ways subtle enough to overlook. A notice about future community improvements. A brief mention of easement reviews. Buried deep in the HOA's email updates. Surveyors spotted in distant common areas, supposedly taking routine measurements. None of it seemed important at the time. But it planted an uneasy feeling that something was shifting behind the scenes. It was the type of shift most residents ignored until it affected them directly. The homeowner wasn't the type to be paranoid. They valued routines, took pride in maintaining their property, and genuinely enjoyed the quiet privacy the backyard provided. That small strip of land might not have been glamorous, but it offered a sense of space. Space to breathe, space to unwind. Space that felt undeniably theirs. It played a bigger role in their life than they realized, becoming the backdrop of early morning coffee, weekend projects, and moments of solitude after long days. It was more than dirt and grass, it was part of their home. But even in a peaceful community, there are always undercurrents. The HOA president, a person known for treating the neighborhood like their personal kingdom, had slowly been pushing for changes that gave the board more control. New landscaping rules, stricter parking guidelines, property inspections that felt invasive rather than routine. Some residents grumbled quietly, but most adapted, believing that pushing back would only make things worse. Still, an unspoken tension hovered over community meetings, the kind that suggested something larger was brewing. What the homeowner didn't know, what no one outside the board was supposed to know, was that the HOA had been quietly searching for ways to increase accessibility to several undeveloped lots on the far end of the neighborhood. Those lots were difficult to reach, tucked behind rows of existing homes. The HOA had considered multiple solutions, none of them simple, until one board member pointed to a map and casually suggested an alternative, a straight path, cut through the land behind a handful of houses, including the homeowners. It wasn't approved publicly. It wasn't even announced. It was simply talked about in vague terms under long-term planning, and then tucked away until the board was ready to act. They assumed no one would notice until it was too late. After all, most homeowners didn't pay attention to the fine print, and most didn't question authority, especially authority wrapped in the polite language of a homeowners association. Meanwhile, the homeowner continued living their life, unaware that their quiet mornings and calm weekends were being treated like optional details by people who valued convenience and control over fairness. The land behind their home wasn't just a target, it was the most convenient solution to a problem they didn't create. And soon, the HOA would try to take advantage of that convenience in the boldest way possible. Everything still appeared normal. The neighborhood still looked polished and peaceful. But beneath that polished surface, something was moving. Something the homeowner could sense only as a subtle, growing tension. The kind that made them glance at those survey flags a little longer, or reread HOA emails with a feeling they couldn't quite explain. The stage was set long before the first engine revved behind their property. The conflict was already in motion. It was only a matter of time before the quiet neighborhood revealed a much darker, far more aggressive side. And when it did, the homeowner would discover just how far the HOA was willing to go, and how far they would have to go to fight back. The first real sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning, when a letter arrived that looked more official than anything the homeowner had ever received from the HOA. The envelope was rigid, the kind used for legal notices, and the HOA's logo was printed at the top with an almost smug boldness. Inside was a preliminary notice of assessment, claiming that a portion of the land behind the homeowner's property was under review for potential reclassification. At first glance, it looked like bureaucratic nonsense, a strange formality that meant nothing. But the final line changed everything. The HOA reserved the right to access said land for inspection and improvement purposes. Improvement. A word that seemed harmless, yet carried a weight the homeowner couldn't ignore. They reread the letter multiple times, searching for clarity, but the wording was intentionally vague. Still, the unease they had felt earlier, the odd survey flags, the quiet hints in emails, suddenly took on a more sinister shape. Something was being set in motion, and the notice suggested the HOA thought it had the authority to do it without resistance. It was the first domino tipping forward, and soon the rest began to fall. Days later, a second letter arrived. This one accused the homeowner of impeding future community development by positioning yard equipment too close to an access area. The accusation made no sense. There was no access area behind the home, no right of way, nothing to justify such a claim. But the HOA treated it like fact, issuing a fine for obstruction. Their message was clear: they were establishing a narrative, one where the homeowner was the problem, not the HOA. The homeowner appealed the fine immediately, confident the board would recognize the mistake. But the answer came back quicker than expected: appeal denied. That's when the fear set in. Not fear of paying a fine, but fear of what the HOA was building toward. The board wasn't just making errors. They were constructing a paper trail, laying groundwork for something much bigger. Then the harassment began. Not in the loud, obvious way people imagine, but in the subtle, calculated manner of those who abuse their power. The homeowner began receiving violation notices for things that had never been issues before. Grass supposedly too long, trash bins not pulled in fast enough, a decorative planter positioned 3 inches beyond the approved aesthetic guideline. Each notice arrived with a pointed tone, the kind that dripped with condescension and hinted at further consequences. Other residents began whispering about the homeowner at community events, repeating rumors planted by board members about someone trying to block the neighborhood's progress. Some neighbors grew distant, unsure whom to believe. Others avoided eye contact entirely. It was emotional isolation, engineered to wear down resistance. But the homeowner didn't fold. Instead, they pushed back with questions, emails, and requests for clarification. They demanded explanations for the sudden surge of violations, the reclassification notice, the denied appeal. The board responded with cold formalities, offering no real answers. The tension escalated further when a group of board members appeared unannounced behind the property, clipboards in hand, measuring the ground as if it already belonged to them. The homeowner watched from the back porch, a mixture of disbelief and anger rising in their chest. There had been no notice of inspection, no consent. When approached, the board members said only that the area was being assessed for accessibility improvements. They refused to elaborate. The homeowner felt the shift fully then. This was no misunderstanding. The HOA had a plan, and they were moving forward with it, whether the homeowner liked it or not. One morning, the sound of metal stakes being driven into the ground jolted the homeowner awake. Rushing outside, they found workers hammering fresh markers into the grass, creating a straight line through the yard's rear boundary. Some were spray, painted with arrows, others labeled with measurements. The entire scene felt invasive, like a stranger rifling through private belongings. When confronted, one of the workers simply said they were following the HOA's orders. No paperwork, no explanation, just orders. The homeowner demanded answers from the HOA president, who responded with a rehearsed, dismissive explanation. The land was part of a community easement, and the HOA had full rights to develop it for the overall benefit of the neighborhood. It didn't matter that the homeowner had documents showing the property line clearly included that land. The president waved it off, saying the records were under review. That phrase, under review, became the HOA's favorite shield. Every question was met with it. Every challenge was met with it. Every attempt to stand up for property rights was drowned in a fog of bureaucratic deflection. Then came the fines. Not just 1 or 2, but a barrage. The homeowner received more violations in 3 weeks than in their entire time living there. The fines piled up like ammunition, each one framed as another instance of non-compliance. The message was unmistakable: comply with the HOA's plans, or they would financially suffocate you. The anxiety was constant, pressing like a weight on the homeowner's chest. Nights became restless, filled with worry about what would come next. But in the middle of the fear, something else took root. A quiet determination. The HOA was pushing. But the homeowner realized they weren't powerless. There was a fight coming, and they refused to be the one to break first. The next escalation arrived as quietly as the first letter, but carried far more menace. A pre-construction assessment notice was left in the mailbox, stating that the HOA would be conducting site evaluations in preparation for a new common access lane. There was no vote mentioned, no approval from residents, no transparency. The homeowner felt the anger burning hotter than ever. The HOA wasn't just bending rules, they were rewriting them entirely. When the homeowner demanded to see the paperwork authorizing the project, the board stalled. They cited confidentiality. They referenced long-term planning documents. But they never produced the one thing that mattered: a legitimate approval process. The tipping point came a few days later, when the homeowner returned from work to find orange construction fencing stretched across the rear border of their property. It was a physical barrier, installed without warning, cutting off access to part of the yard. Attached to the fencing was a laminated sign reading, HOA Improvement Area. Do not enter. It felt surreal, like the homeowner had stepped into a nightmare version of their own life. They tore the sign off, took pictures of everything, and prepared to confront the HOA at the next board meeting. That meeting, however, turned into chaos. The homeowner arrived early, only to find the board had closed the session to residents, claiming it was a planning-only meeting. They refused to let anyone in, including the homeowner whose land they were trying to seize. A group of frustrated residents gathered outside the locked door, confused and increasingly suspicious. The murmurs grew into questions. What was the HOA hiding? Why was the board acting with such secrecy? The homeowner felt something shift that night. Not just frustration, but a sense of shared outrage from others who had also felt ignored or overruled in smaller ways. For the first time, the board's absolute control seemed to crack. The next morning, the construction stakes were rearranged again, this time stretching even deeper into the homeowner's property. The intrusion was so blatant it bordered on taunting. It was the HOA's way of saying, "You can protest, but we're still moving forward." But the homeowner wasn't intimidated. They began researching property laws, easement rights, and past HOA cases. Every document they uncovered, every statute they read, revealed just how far the HOA had stepped out of bounds. Their actions weren't just unethical, they were illegal. Still, the HOA continued to escalate. A new letter arrived accusing the homeowner of interfering with construction activity, even though no approved construction existed. Another violation claimed the homeowner had damaged community property by removing the fencing from their own land. The absurdity of it all would have been laughable if it weren't so dangerous. By now, the homeowner knew they were being cornered intentionally. The HOA was building a case to justify their actions, hoping sheer pressure would force compliance. But instead of folding, the homeowner did something the HOA didn't expect. They hired a surveyor. When the surveyor drove up with professional equipment and began taking precise measurements, the HOA president practically sprinted down the street to interfere. They demanded the survey stop, claiming it was unauthorized. But the surveyor ignored them. The homeowner had every right to verify their own property boundaries, and when the measurements were completed, the results were undeniable. The HOA was not just wrong, they were trespassing. The stakes, the fencing, the planned road, all of it cut straight through privately owned land. When the homeowner confronted the board with the results, they expected shock or denial. Instead, they got something far worse: silence. The kind of silence that reveals guilt. The kind that confirms the board knew exactly what they were doing all along. That silence became the moment everything shifted. The homeowner realized the HOA wasn't acting out of confusion or incompetence. They were acting out of entitlement. They wanted the land, and they believed they could take it by force, by fines, by intimidation, or by burying the homeowner in enough hassle to make them give up. But they had underestimated the one thing that would become their downfall. The homeowner wasn't about to roll over, and what they did next would drag the HOA into a battle they never expected, and definitely weren't prepared to lose. The showdown began on a cold morning that felt heavier than the weather itself, the kind of morning where the air seemed to brace for impact. The homeowner woke to the unmistakable roar of machinery. Louder, closer, more aggressive than before. When they rushed outside, they saw it, a full construction crew, complete with a small bulldozer, positioned directly behind their property line. Not near it. Not close to it. On it. Bright orange cones lined the grass. A chalked outline stretched across the yard like surgical marks before an operation. It wasn't a warning. It was an announcement. The HOA had decided this was happening, documentation be damned. Workers stood ready with stakes, tape measures, equipment belts, and an indifference to the homeowner's outrage. The HOA president was already there, dressed in a reflective vest they had no reason to be wearing, hands clasped behind their back like a self-appointed overseer. They greeted the homeowner with the kind of practiced calm that made the whole thing feel even more sinister. They said the project was within HOA authority. They said the board had full approval. They said any interference would result in immediate legal action. They said a lot of things meant to intimidate, to shut down resistance before it could happen. But the homeowner wasn't listening anymore. They were watching the bulldozer inch forward, its bucket lowering as if preparing to scoop a trench straight through the property. That was the moment something broke. Not in the homeowner, but in the illusion the HOA had built. The idea that they were untouchable. That their authority was absolute. That no one would dare challenge them. The homeowner stepped forward, planting themselves directly in the path of the machine. Workers froze. The bulldozer halted with a lurch. The HOA president's facade cracked for the first time, revealing a flicker of uncertainty behind the arrogance. For a heartbeat, everything stood still. Then the homeowner spoke. Not with the tremor of fear the HOA expected, but with the clarity of someone who had reached their limit. They announced that the HOA had two options: stop immediately, or deal with the consequences of knowingly trespassing on private property. The president scoffed, calling it ridiculous. They claimed the land wasn't private. They claimed the homeowner was misinformed. They claimed the survey results were invalid. But the more they argued, the more frantic their voice became, as if they could feel the situation slipping out of their grip. That's when the homeowner pulled out the folder. Inside was everything: the official survey, property maps, easement documents, state regulations, and the homeowner's written request for the HOA's supposed approval records, which the board had never produced. It was a stack of proof, each page a nail in the coffin of the HOA's lies. But the true blow came when the homeowner pulled out the last document. A certified letter from their attorney. One the HOA didn't know existed. The homeowner read it aloud in front of the workers, neighbors who had gathered, and the HOA president, who stood frozen in place. The letter stated clearly that any attempt to alter, trespass, or modify the homeowner's property without explicit permission would result in immediate litigation. Litigation that included damages, injunctions, and the pursuit of personal liability for any board member who exceeded their legal authority. That last part hit like a lightning strike. Suddenly, the workers looked at each other uncertainly. The bulldozer operator set the brake and shut off the engine. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd of neighbors. The HOA president's confidence evaporated in real time. Their face flushed. Their mouth opened and closed without sound. But the true climax wasn't the letter. It was what happened next. A neighbor stepped forward. Someone who had previously remained silent out of fear of retaliation. They admitted they had attended a closed-door HOA planning session weeks earlier, one the board thought no one would question. They revealed that the board had known the land belonged to the homeowner, that they had discussed ways to fast-track construction before homeowners could respond, that they had deliberately withheld documents, that they had even joked the homeowner would give up once the work started. Every word hit the president like a physical blow, and then another neighbor stepped forward, and another. Each shared small details. Comments overheard, inconsistencies noticed, strange behavior at meetings, all pointing to a board that had knowingly abused its power. The HOA president tried to deny everything. They raised their voice, insisting the neighbors were misremembering, that the homeowner was manipulating them, that the board had acted in good faith. But the desperation in their tone only made them sound guiltier. Then came the moment the homeowner would replay in their mind for years. The construction foreman approached the HOA president. Calm, professional, direct. He stated that his crew would not continue the project, not without documentation proving the HOA had the right to order work on private property. He asked the president for those documents. The president had nothing, no permits, no approvals, nothing. It was the first public acknowledgement of the HOA's failure, and it sent shockwaves through the small crowd gathered behind the property. Neighbors stared at the president, their expressions shifting from confusion to betrayal to anger. The board members who had accompanied the president slowly backed away, unable to defend what was unfolding. Their silence was damning. The homeowner didn't raise their voice. They didn't need to. The truth was doing the work for them. Then, the most unexpected thing happened. One of the board members, someone who had always followed the president's lead, stepped forward with trembling hands. They apologized. Not directly to the homeowner, but to the crowd. They admitted the president had pushed the project aggressively, that they had pressured the board to approve it quietly, that they had insisted the land behind the homeowner's property was open for interpretation, even when maps said otherwise, that they had dismissed concerns, silenced questions, and manipulated meeting notes to make it appear as though there had been unanimous support. The confession cracked the situation wide open. Neighbors gasped. The foreman stepped back. The president turned pale. And for the first time, they looked genuinely afraid. Not of losing power, but of the consequences that were now unavoidable. The homeowner didn't celebrate. There was no triumph yet. This was only the moment the truth surfaced, like a monster finally rising from deep water. And the monster wasn't the HOA president. It was everything the president had done behind closed doors. The president tried to flee the scene, muttering something about calling the association's attorney. But as they walked away, multiple neighbors pulled out their phones, recording everything: the workers, the fencing, the stakes on private land, the confrontation, the president's frantic denials. The president realized too late that the situation had spiraled far beyond their control. The homeowner watched them go, heart pounding, adrenaline coursing through their veins. They had expected a fight. They had expected a struggle. But they had never expected a public unraveling. The construction crew packed up, removing every cone, every marker, every trace of the intrusion. The foreman apologized personally, explaining that they were merely following orders, and that they had no idea the HOA lacked authority. The homeowner nodded, appreciating the honesty, But even as the machinery rolled away and the crowd thinned, the tension didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. Because now, with the HOA exposed, there was only one question left hanging in the cool morning air. What would the consequences be for the people who had orchestrated all of this? And how far would the president go to avoid them? The homeowner didn't know it yet, but the real fallout was just beginning, and what happened next would shake the entire HOA to its core. In the days that followed the confrontation, the neighborhood hummed with a strange mixture of tension and awakening. It was as if a long, buried truth had finally surfaced, and now everyone was seeing the HOA, and themselves, through a new lens. No one could pretend anymore that the board was just a group of well-meaning volunteers who occasionally got carried away. The facade had cracked, and the rot underneath was visible to everyone. The homeowner didn't have to take action immediately. The community did it for them. The videos neighbors had recorded spread through the development faster than any official HOA announcement ever had. People shared clips in private group chats, on neighborhood pages, and even in email chains to board members. Residents who had never cared much about HOA operations suddenly became very interested in knowing what the board had been doing behind the scenes. Questions turned into demands. Demands turned into meetings. And meetings turned into a storm the HOA president could no longer outrun. By the end of the week, the board had no choice but to call an emergency, community-wide meeting. The homeowner walked in knowing this was the moment everything would hinge on. The normally quiet clubhouse was filled to capacity, with people standing shoulder to shoulder, whispering, frowning, and shaking their heads as they replayed the events in their minds. The air was thick with anticipation and resentment. For the first time, the president didn't stand at the front with the confidence of someone who believed they controlled the room. They walked in stiffly, face drawn tight, eyes scanning for allies who no longer wanted to be seen siding with them. The board members followed, looking equally uneasy. No one smiled. There were no opening jokes, no attempts to soften the tension. They all knew the community wanted answers, and there were none that would paint them in a favorable light. The president began speaking, voice strained, insisting the board had acted with only the neighborhood's best interests in mind. They blamed miscommunication, misinterpretation, and even overzealous planning. They tried to redirect blame onto contractors, onto outdated maps, onto anything and anyone except themselves. But this time, the community didn't accept it. Hands shot up. People spoke over one another. Voices rose, not in chaos, but in collective outrage. Residents demanded to know why no vote had occurred, why property boundaries had been ignored, why construction had been ordered without permits, why lies had been told about easement rights, why the board had withheld documents and conducted closed-door sessions that broke the association's bylaws. The homeowner stayed quiet for most of it, allowing the voices around them to carry what they had held alone for far too long. It was both empowering and heartbreaking. Empowering because the truth had finally galvanized others. Heartbreaking because the HOA had once had the trust of so many good people. When the president finally tried to shut down the backlash, claiming the meeting was becoming unproductive, the homeowner stood up. The room fell silent. They didn't raise their voice. They didn't need to. The power was in the truth everyone had already witnessed. They explained, in clear and measured detail, every step the HOA had taken, from the vague letters to the fines, from the trespassing to the fencing, from the bulldozer to the attempt to intimidate them into submission. They described the stress, the financial strain, the isolation, and the emotional toll of being targeted by the very group that was supposed to protect property values and community harmony. And then, they ended with one sentence that struck the room like a hammer. If they were willing to do this to me, why wouldn't they do it to any of you? The weight of that truth lingered in the air. People exchanged uneasy glances. Some nodded. Some clenched their jaws. But everyone understood the problem wasn't just the president or the project. The problem was deeper. The unchecked power, the secrecy, the arrogance, the culture of intimidation that had been normalized over time. The board tried to recover, but the damage was irreversible. By a near unanimous vote, the community motioned to remove the HOA president from their position effective immediately. The president protested, threatened legal action, tried to invalidate the vote, but no one listened. The bylaws allowed for removal, and the residents executed that right decisively. 3 other board members resigned on the spot, rather than face the same backlash. The remaining 2 stepped down quietly within the week, leaving the homeowners' evidence as a permanent stain on their reputations. That could have been the end, but it wasn't. The homeowner, guided by their attorney, filed an official claim against the HOA, not out of revenge, but to protect their rights. The trespassing alone was enough to justify significant damages. The unauthorized construction attempts, the fines, the harassment, the misuse of HOA authority, every piece added weight to the case. By the time the HOA's insurance reviewed the situation, it was clear who was at fault. The association settled quickly, offering compensation that covered survey costs, property restoration, legal fees, and additional damages for stress and disruption. It wasn't a fortune, but it was justice. Measured, undeniable justice. More importantly, the settlement included something far more meaningful. A written acknowledgement that the land behind the homeowner's property belonged solely to them, with no easements, no shared access, no reinterpretations, and no loopholes. It permanently protected their property from future overreach. And that wasn't the only change the community made. Residents drafted new bylaws that required transparency in all board decisions, mandatory community votes for any significant project, open access to meeting records, and term limits for all board members. They created a system of accountability that ensured no single person, or small group of people, could ever hijack power again. Ironically, the crisis made the neighborhood stronger than it had ever been. People talked more. They participated more. They paid attention. The community that once felt quietly controlled by a small circle of authority became a place where residents had a genuine voice. Even neighbors who had been distant reached out, some apologizing, others thanking the homeowner for exposing what they themselves had feared to challenge. But the most profound change happened where few could see it, inside the homeowner. What began as a violation of their space had turned into something much larger. They had walked through intimidation, frustration, sleepless nights, and fear, only to discover a resilience they didn't know they possessed. They had faced down an organization built on rules and bureaucracy and emerged stronger, calmer, and more confident than before. Their backyard, once a quiet sanctuary, now carried a deeper meaning. It was no longer just space. It was something they had fought for, something they had defended against people who believed their authority mattered more than someone's home. On summer evenings, when the light filtered through the trees and the grass swayed in the breeze, the homeowner felt a peace they had earned. A peace that wasn't naive or fragile, but grounded in the knowledge that they had stood against something unjust and won. And every time they noticed the absence of stakes, fencing, or intruding machinery, a subtle, triumphant smile would cross their face. The HOA would rebuild with new members, people chosen for integrity, not control. The president who had orchestrated everything moved away quietly, unwilling to stay in a place where their reputation had disintegrated. No one missed them. The neighborhood slowly healed. The tension faded. The whispers died down. But the lessons remained. Power without accountability is dangerous. Silence enables abuse. And sometimes, the only way to protect your home is to stand up. Even when standing up feels like a battle, you can't win. The homeowner never wanted to become a symbol of resistance. They never asked to lead a community into a reckoning. They never imagined their peaceful neighborhood would become the site of a confrontation that spiraled into legal action and leadership collapse. But sometimes you don't choose the fight. Sometimes the fight chooses you. And when it does, you discover who you truly are. In the end, the HOA lost far more than money or control. They lost the trust they had treated so carelessly. They lost the power they had abused. They lost the illusion that they could act without consequence. The homeowner, meanwhile, gained something priceless: peace, empowerment, and the knowledge that doing the right thing, even when you stand alone, can change everything. And maybe that's the question that lingers long after the dust settles. When someone tries to take what is yours, whether it's land, peace, or dignity, how far are you willing to go to protect it? Sometimes the answer is simple: as far as it takes.